cresci no interior de Minas Gerais, numa cidadezinha chamada São José do Buriti. É uma cidade muito pequena.
Eu sou de Fortaleza, nascido e criado em Fortaleza. Estudava numa escola de bairro, depois mudei para uma escola maior.
E eu tinha sonhos de estudar, muito porque minha mãe não tinha tido oportunidade de estudar. E ela sempre me incentivou muito.
Eu sempre estudei em escolas públicas, né? Eu venho de uma família de baixa renda. Ao longo do meu ensino médio, eu cursei ensino técnico em administração, integrado ao médio, numa ETEC do interior de São Paulo.
E eu entrei no site, eu vi que tinha um programa de bolsas. Eu me apaixonei pela escola, me apaixonei pela visão da escola. E eu vi que eu me enquadrava no perfil.
Por acaso, eu acabei conhecendo o Insper, acabei entrando no site do Insper, fiquei completamente apaixonada pelo curso de engenharia que tinha aquela proposta hands-on, aquela proposta mão na massa, uma proposta completamente disruptiva para um curso de engenharia no Brasil, e eu resolvi prestar o programa de bolsas.
Eu descobri o Insper, cara, eu já estava fazendo faculdade lá em Fortaleza, descobri que existia a faculdade, o Insper, descobri o programa de bolsas, me inscrevi, passei e vim.
No dia que saiu a resposta da bolsa, né, eu tava ansiosa, esperando, falei, meu Deus, o que vai acontecer? Liguei pra minha mãe e falei, mãe, passei, já sei qual faculdade que eu quero ir, agora não preciso escolher mais, porque eu tenho certeza que é o Insper.
Eu nunca senti algo antes como aquilo. Pra mim era a concretização de todos os sonhos que aquela menina tinha. E naquele momento, eu não sabia que a minha vida ia mudar tanto.
Primeiro, a primeira coisa, se não existisse bolsa, não existia nessa no Insper, entendeu? Não tem como, não fazia, estava muito longe da nossa realidade, então acho que poder entrar numa universidade da qualidade do Insper só foi possível para mim pela bolsa.
O grande objetivo do programa de bolsas, né, do ponto de vista institucional, era trazer diversidade para o corpo docente. Na verdade, criar um corpo docente, construir um corpo docente diverso, de ideias, de propósitos, de visão de mundo.
O que eu acho que é uma das grandes qualidades da população brasileira, que é a capacidade de lidar com a diversidade. E todos nós sabemos a quantidade de talentos que estão por aí mundo afora e que obviamente não têm oportunidade. Aliás, esse é um dos problemas do Brasil, tolerância e oportunidade.
É uma realidade mesmo que a depender do CEP onde você nasce vai destinar seu futuro. Isso é inadmissível.
Todas as pessoas que nascem no Brasil têm que ter as mesmas oportunidades para realizar seus sonhos. Não importa se elas nascem na periferia de São Paulo, na zona rural no Nordeste, em bairros ricos, todos têm que ter a mesma oportunidade.
A gente começou a colocar esforços onde estão esses talentos acadêmicos, porque a questão financeira, a escola estava preparada para suprir, e a parte deles era trazer o gosto pelo estudo, a curiosidade intelectual, acreditar na educação como meio de geração de possibilidades para eles na vida, e a gente teve o desafio, então, de investigar e procurar esse pessoal. Até no Ceará a gente foi parar, né?
O mundo ele é muito maior do que essas 8 quadras que cercam a faculdade. E trazer gente de fora, você traz, cara, perspectivas diferentes de problemas, você traz novos problemas para dentro da faculdade. Eu acho que tem um ganho de ter diversidade dentro do corpo de alunos, que é super importante para a formação, tanto como profissionais, mas para a formação cidadã também, que eu acho que a faculdade faz parte disso.
A história do Insper é uma trajetória, as coisas vão acontecendo, é um processo. Então nós temos vários marcos. Um marco importante foi a criação das nossas bolsas não restituíveis integrais. Outro marco aí foi mais gradual, é o engajamento progressivo dos nossos ex-alunos, chamados alumni, no nosso fundo de bolsa. Nós temos um número crescente de alumni que hoje contribuem para o Fundo de Bolsas, o que nos deixa extremamente felizes e orgulhosos. Outro marco importante foi a Toca da Raposa, que foi o primeiro dormitório que nós tivemos aqui no Insper, voltado para os bolsistas integrais.
Para pessoas como eu, que são de fora de São Paulo, existe a Toca da Raposa, né, que é um residencial incrível que foi construído pelo Insper para abrigar esses talentos do país inteiro e conseguir viabilizar que essas pessoas estudem no Insper. Então, é um espaço bastante colaborativo que me possibilita me dedicar integralmente aos estudos no Insper.
O programa de bolsa permite que essas pessoas, que esses jovens, consigam atingir seus sonhos, cursar os cursos de interesse numa instituição de excelência. E isso vai refletir em toda a vida desses jovens. Do lado da instituição é muito importante porque esses alunos trazem um dinamismo grande para a escola.
O Insper também é um sonho de quem acredita no Brasil, né? Eu acho que aí todo mundo sai um pouco imbuído dessa vontade de fazer diferença, levando esse senso de pertencimento, esse olhar pragmático para onde a gente vai depois de sair aqui do 4x300.
Insper, na verdade, vem de inspirar e pertencer. Então, esse pertencer que nós queremos realmente colocar os nossos alunos, que eles pertencem à nossa comunidade. Eles, na realidade, estão ligados à escola perenemente.
Então, a gente colocou muita energia em criar esse senso de comunidade, de engajamento, de amor à camisa, porque independentemente de qualquer contrato, é em outro lugar que está esse compromisso.
Meu sonho também é poder adotar alguém como mentora, como madrinha para o programa de bolsas e poder devolver ao Insper tudo que eu recebi.
Eu posso acompanhar hoje como doador, como parceiro do Insper, iniciativas, né? Ter essa troca e poder ajudar pessoas que vêm de uma realidade parecida com a minha, acho que isso para mim é muito legal.
É um grande desafio e nós estamos aqui no Insper, dentro do nosso microcosmo, que é ensino superior, dentro daquilo que nós achamos que podemos fazer bem e adicionar valor, procurando fazer o melhor para contribuir para esse fim.
E eu espero que o programa de bolsas esteja apenas começando, porque é claro que todos nós aqui temos um limite, mas ele de fato cria, enfim, impactos mais que proporcionais.
É muito bom pensar no futuro do programa, né? Daquilo que a gente colhendo os benefícios do que evoluiu até aqui, e o que a gente espera, o que a gente sonha para frente.
Eu acho que hoje trabalhar com a educação é pensar que a oportunidade não pode ser só para alguns, não pode ser para o aluno que já está engajado, tem que ser para engajar um aluno também.
Tem que pensar grande, tem que sonhar. Quanto mais jovens a gente forma, né? Quanto maior a oferta, né, de um programa desse para esses jovens, maior o impacto potencial para o nosso país.
Boa tarde, estamos aqui para mais um episódio do nosso ciclo aqui, Cidade e Pandemia, os desafios e as oportunidades do planejamento urbano após esse, enfim, período aí que nós todos estamos vivendo. Queria muito agradecer a presença de todos que nos assistem, queria agradecer muito aqui o Martim, tem sido aqui o companheiro, né, dessa jornada, junto com a Camila. A Camila não está aqui hoje com a gente nesse painel, mas, enfim, tem sido aqui o nosso companheiro de jornada, e também o Pedro Burgos, aqui do Núcleo de Jornalismo, Comunicação e Jornalismo do Insper. O Martim é diretor do Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, ele é o responsável pelo programa para a América Latina e Caribe, né? E também temos hoje aqui o privilégio de contar com o vice-presidente do Lincoln Institute. O Pedro, em seguida, vai falar o currículo dele, que é o senhor Armando Carbonell. Nós estamos fazendo aqui a introdução em português e depois nós vamos passar para o inglês. Eu, enfim, queria dizer que tem sido para a gente uma oportunidade assim, única, assim, falar e ter vivenciado e oportunidade de enfim, aprender mais sobre os desafios das cidades. Acho que nós estamos hoje, o mundo vive uma situação nova para essa geração, seguramente nenhum de nós passou por essa situação, principalmente as pessoas que estão no comando da gestão e do planejamento urbano das cidades no mundo, e isso de fato trouxe uma agenda, enfim, muito importante, muito relevante e principalmente muito impactante na vida das cidades. Nós não sabemos ainda os resultados e quais serão as consequências, né, mais efetivas ou duradouras dessa pandemia, mas seguramente há mudanças, isso acho que é inquestionável, de todo tipo de natureza. Então, hoje nós temos aqui para discutir, nós tivemos o ciclo nacional, passamos para o ciclo nacional com a experiência internacional, com a experiência de Portugal, do Porto, com a experiência de Hanoi, com a experiência de Bogotá, e hoje temos aqui o Armando Carbonell, que, enfim, que tem um currículo aqui, o Pedro vai resumir o currículo para simplificar, mas que tem uma vasta experiência, seja nos Estados Unidos, seja na Inglaterra, e seja no mundo em urban planning. Então, eu vou passar aqui para o Pedro, ele vai contar o currículo, e depois eu volto aqui para a gente dar sequência ao nosso webinar.
Obrigado, Tomás. Bom, a gente vai só fazer essa introdução em português, né? O Armando Carbonell, ele é vice-presidente de programas do Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Ele começou nessa área de planejamento urbano como secretário de planejamento em Cape Cod, lá nos Estados Unidos. Depois ele foi professor de planejamento urbano em Harvard, na Universidade de Pensilvânia. Foi editor do Atual Planning Review, que é um jornal britânico, né, sobre planejamento. Ele tem experiência como consultor nessa área, em várias cidades do mundo, como Houston, no Texas, na China. Então, essa análise, essa possibilidade de fazer uma análise global, né, com especial ênfase nas experiências dos Estados Unidos e do Reino Unido, que interessa a gente aqui, nosso assunto.
Perfeito. Bom, eu vou passar a palavra para o senhor Armando Carbonell, ele vai fazer uma breve apresentação e depois nós vamos abrir aqui para perguntas. O Martim, em seguida, fará suas considerações sobre os tópicos que o senhor Armando vai trazer e depois nós vamos conduzir aqui, Pedro e eu, o debate. As perguntas podem ser postadas para quem nos assiste no chat da transmissão. Bom, vamos lá. Mr. Armando, first of all, we are so grateful that you could attend our invitation to be here with us and share your experience and your thoughts about the future of the cities facing this new condition, or at least new for us. Of course, we have faced that before in several times in the history of the cities, but now it's a new situation for urban planners. And really for us, having you to share your thoughts and also your experience and your, let's say, impressions about what will happen with the cities in US and UK, particularly because, of course, you have experience in all the countries all over the world. And for us, it's such a privilege having you. Thank you so much for accepting. We will start with your presentation.
Thanks so much, Tomas. It's a pleasure to join all of you this afternoon at this last in a series of webinars on the COVID-19 pandemic and urban planning. I know you've been dealing with a series of issues that have come out of the pandemic, the fiscal challenge, questions of governance, agility in public management, and social and spatial exclusion. And I'm going to touch on all of these issues from a perspective coming from the United States and the United Kingdom. And I'll be drawing on the benefits I've had in an exercise we've done at the Lincoln Institute on scenario planning and the COVID virus, as well as a series of meetings we've been doing with big city planning directors across the United States. And I'll fill you in on that group in a minute. And as far as the UK goes, I've worked in the United Kingdom for many years and have just now finished my term as a commissioner on something called the UK 2070 Commission, looking out 50 years at issues of regional disparities across the United Kingdom, and have just been engaged in the last week in reviewing our response to the coronavirus in terms of how it affects long-term planning for equity across the United Kingdom. So I'll be drawing on that in part as well. I was also pleased to have been with colleagues on Friday to prepare for this, and they've raised a number of questions that I hope to be able to touch on as well after I make some brief remarks on both the US and the United Kingdom. So first of all, let me talk about scenario planning. It's one of our most important tools at the Lincoln Institute, and it's something that we've been developing for years. I've been dealing with scenarios for much of my professional career as an urban planner. And the way we think about scenarios is not really about predicting the future, but about dealing with the uncertainty of the future by considering plausible future conditions, not necessarily the most probable ones, but the possible ones that can affect how our strategies will come out. And the idea is to construct these scenarios, to consider the range of possible outcomes that we might have to deal with, and then see how our strategies will fare if one or another of them actually becomes reality. And the idea then is to adjust our strategies so that we have the best possible results or avoid the worst results, at least. So at the Lincoln Institute, at the beginning of this crisis, we constructed 4 scenarios looking out across the next 18 months. And so we're almost 6 months into this. So I guess you could say it's about a 2-year perspective from today, from when we started. And we looked at 2 variables. We looked at the level of control of the virus and the condition of the economy. And obviously the 2 are related, and considered what you might call the most rosy scenario, the best case, which is rapid control of the virus and rapid economic recovery. And we also considered the most dire possibilities, where both high death rates, high incidence of the virus, and a very slow and feeble recovery of the economy took place. One of the scenarios that's been particularly fascinating is the one we called riding the corona roller coaster. You can imagine a roller coaster with big swings in the number of cases, control periods followed by spikes in the incidence of the virus, and swings in the economy as well. And you might say we've been going through those in the United States and around the world. So it's actually a very useful scenario. And it's a tough one because it obviously varies across the United States, and in a federal system of government, as we have in the United States, states have adopted different policies and have had different experiences with the virus. And there's actually been a relatively weak federal response. I'm sure you've all heard about this, but it has really not been a very coordinated response to the virus. And as a result, it makes a big difference which state you're in. And so when we talk to our city planning directors, city policies matter, but state policies matter a lot too. And I'll get into that in a minute. One of the things we've been concerned about is this spatial pattern, and not just across the US, but across the world, because we're a global organization and we have partners and people we serve really all over the world. And the way the virus has moved, across the planet and continues to erupt in different places has a big effect on our ability to do our work and whether we can be effective or not. One of the findings we've taken away from our scenario planning and from our early experience is we're going to have to do a lot of our work remotely. We haven't worked in the office for 5 months, and we don't plan to be back in the office anytime soon. But again, as an international organization, we rely on travel for much of our work, and we've relied in the past on in-person events for most of our effectiveness. And I think one of the things we've learned is we can be effective through webinars like this, and in some ways even more effective in reaching people and doing our job. And I think that's not only something that the Institute has learned, but many organizations have found a way to be adaptive and function under these conditions. And I think that's a relatively good story, the high level of adaptability. Another takeaway, I think, from our consideration of these scenarios is that life is likely to be different after the recovery than it was before the virus took off. And I think there's a lot of interest in circles of people who think about urbanism to consider, what is the city going to be like after the virus? What's it going to be like into the period after 2 years from now, let's say? I know there's a lot of speculation about this and many different opinions. And I guess I've been emboldened to think I'll give you a few of my own speculations and opinions a bit later on about what the city might be like, and try to respond to some of the questions colleagues have raised. So let me talk a little bit about our Big City Planning Directors Group. These are the heads of the planning organizations for the 30 largest cities in the United States. We've been meeting with them for the last 20 plus years, convening an institute with Harvard University and the American Planning Association every fall in Cambridge, bringing them together again at the National Planning Conference of the American Planning Association every spring. And of course, this year we couldn't meet. And as an alternative, we decided to start meeting remotely in webinars, much like this, every month. So we've now increased our exposure to this group, and we've very much been dealing with their challenges as they respond to the pandemic in each of these sessions. And they've touched on some of the issues that this webinar series has been talking about. So I'll talk about just a couple of them briefly, and maybe draw on this as well as we get into a conversation with the larger group and with colleagues here. So one of the issues that has been on the minds of the planning directors is very much the concern for racial equity. The coronavirus has had such obvious disparate effects on people of color in the United States in terms of the rates of incidence and rates of death that it has now become impossible to ignore the conditions of racial segregation in the United States. And I'm sure you've seen that there have been demonstrations across the country. There's been considerable amount of civic unrest in many cities, and a new readiness to address racial inequality. And this extends to the city planning directors who are looking for ways to directly address this as they do their jobs and as they make their plans. And it's not necessarily a new issue for them, but I think it is one of increasing urgency. And they do see themselves as playing a key role in fighting racism. We can get into this more later. It was a high enough priority that we put off our meeting about budgets, which is the other topic that we've gotten into in some depth, in order to address the urgency of racial inequality. But when it comes to budgets, the impacts on the cities have been very variable, and it depends on both the sources of revenue that the cities have, and these range from being highly dependent on the local property tax, which is a typical source of revenue for US cities. And about 2/3 of the cities in our group were most dependent on the property tax. And others that are dependent on things like sales tax and income taxes. And as it turns out, in the short run, during an economic crisis like the one we're in, the sales tax and the income tax are affected much more quickly and much more dramatically than the property tax, which tends to lag in its response. So the sales and income tax dependent cities have actually been hit very hard already and are beginning to have to lay off employees and otherwise cut back on services in ways that are going to affect quality of life and possibly exacerbate inequality in ways that concern us. So the tax source is important, but when it comes to planning, different planning departments are more or less reliant on the city budget. So in at least one case, in our own city of Boston, the planning function is completely independent of the city budget. It's funded from its own independent sources. They have real estate that provides revenue and other sources, permit fees and so forth. And so they have not been affected at all by reduction in the city budget. At the other extreme, we have cities like Denver, where all of the planning budget is paid for out of the city general fund, and they're getting ready to lay off employees. And they don't see a very bright future in the short run because of the cutbacks in the city budget. So this is something that's going to be with us for some time. And I know a related issue that was raised to me in a question has to do with whether we will continue to invest in infrastructure where it's needed when we have such constraints on budgets, both local and state budgets. And I could see this working in two ways. One has to do with the idea of a stimulus. And of course, there already have been trillions of dollars poured into the economy in the United States to try to keep the economy from crashing. And from time to time in the US, we have become fascinated with major infrastructure projects. It generally comes like every 50 years, but when we do get excited about it, we spend a lot of money. And there are some theories that spending money on infrastructure, especially on shovel-ready projects, is a good way to stimulate the economy. Some recent research that the Institute has been involved in suggests that there actually may not be a very big short-term stimulus effect, and infrastructure may not really be that useful in terms of short-term stimulus. But we do know that over the long run, there is a beneficial effect. So we're generally favorable to the idea of infrastructure investment. And obviously, it can also be thought of as a way to deal with regional disparities. So to think a little bit about the UK case, it's certainly a major part of the strategy in the UK to talk about linking up parts of that country that have not been enjoying the benefits that, say, the London and the greater Southeast have enjoyed in terms of economic prosperity. So let me let me mention something about agility and then turn to the UK for the rest of my initial remarks, and we can open this up and discuss in a little while. But one thought about agility in public management in the United States, I've been impressed by the planning directors. They have had to go very quickly from holding public meetings and public hearings to make decisions to doing things remotely. There are a lot of legal ramifications to this. They have to be sure that they give equal access to everybody to these public proceedings. And they've been incredibly creative in figuring out how to do this and getting the proper legal authorization from state attorneys general and so forth. But from what I can see, the planning departments in the US are fully functioning. They're working from home, they're holding meetings remotely, they're processing permits, and there still is construction activity in the United States, and people need permits in order to be able to move ahead with projects. And as I mentioned, some departments, planning departments, are also dependent on revenue from permit fees to pay for their employees. So they've had an incentive to figure out how to keep working, and for the most part, they're still working, even though they're not occupying their offices and they're not holding in-person public meetings. But they've also been doing something really interesting, and that is they have been adapting the physical environment to some of the challenges of the coronavirus in terms of closing streets, making it possible to have more pedestrian and bicycle ways, and also things like outdoor cafes. And in some cities, they have done more in the last month than in the last 10 or 20 years in terms of changing street patterns. And that's because they're using emergency provisions to make changes that are probably not going to go back to the way they were. when the virus is done with. So these are things that suggest some ideas for the future to me in terms of the public realm, in terms of how we use space in cities. And I had been asked an earlier question about what a competitive city will look like in the post-corona future. And I think one of the things a competitive city is going to have is a diversity of options for people to move around, to live and to work. And so having transportation options, including being able to walk, being able to use bicycles, not necessarily having to use an automobile or having to use public transportation, is going to be an important factor. Having safe spaces for people to get outside, get relief from locking themselves up in a safe way, getting exercise, getting fresh air. I think we see how important this is, and I think it's going to have more weight in the future. Providing people with housing options and dealing with the challenges of folks who may need to work at home and deal with those challenges in future setups. Is everybody going to move to the suburbs? Is this all about sprawl? I don't think necessarily at all. I think cities will continue to have terrific advantages, but I think it will be important that they are resilient. And I think we're already seeing evidence of that. I do want to make a few observations about the United Kingdom and the coronavirus before I close my initial remarks and we open up the conversation. The United Kingdom has had a huge impact from the coronavirus. They have had the biggest economic contraction of not only every European country, but every advanced economy. Twice as much of a decline in gross domestic product in the last quarter than the United States has had. So very significant economic impacts. And this is after having the highest death rate in Europe, highest excess death rate in Europe from the coronavirus. So there's some lessons here. 65,000 people have died in the United Kingdom. They've got the deepest recession of any country in Europe and in the G7. And how can this be? Well, they took too long in locking down. That was the main problem. But there is, in a sense, a silver lining, because the significance of the decline in the economy has caused the government to put a lot of energy into what had been its leveling up manifesto. So as I mentioned, I've been working with colleagues in the UK on regional disparities, the ways in which someone who is living in the north of England, for example, is likely to have lower income, lower life expectancy, lower prospects in general than someone who is, say, living in London. And the concern here is how to address that and create a more level playing field. The concept of leveling up, which is a nice turn of phrase from the Prime Minister, is now joining up with a concept called the UK New Deal, very much based on Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal after the Great Depression in the United States. And this amounts to huge investment in infrastructure, in the public sector, and in devolution, which is to say moving government decision-making down to the metropolitan level, to the city level, away from Whitehall, where the national government meets. And we are following this very closely, and I think it has significant implications for governance, significant implications for inequality. And if it's done right, I think this crisis might actually lead to meaningful change in the UK. And this coming from a conservative government, which is remarkable in itself. So I wanted to put that on the table. I had been asked a question about Brexit, and we did some modeling around what the spatial impacts would be of Brexit. And unsurprisingly, it turns out that because there would be a decline in the economy in general, it would be felt disproportionately in the less well-off parts of the United Kingdom. And so spatial inequality would actually increase as a result of Brexit. I think that's modest compared to the consequences of the coronavirus. And I think in a lot of ways, the COVID pandemic has overshadowed Brexit as a policy issue, even though it remains an issue and a challenge. But as I say, in itself, it is requiring a kind of, once in 50-year kind of response from government, and that could lead to some good things. So I remain hopeful that we will see an agenda in the UK that's actually effective in terms of leveling up. And as I say, we have a group, this commission, that is engaged in following this and continuing to promote an action agenda that will change things over time in a serious way. So I think I'm about at time. I've covered some of the issues that have been raised to me, but not in any depth. So please let me know if there's anything you want to explore further, and I'd love to hear from all of you as well.
Okay, Armando, thank you so much. That's exactly that we're expecting from you, and I think you cover it very well. Now, Martin, I'll ask the next word is to you. Please give your thoughts and your ideas about that, and then you can open for the debate and for questions. Everybody that is watching us, they can send their questions in the transmission, the chat of the transmission on YouTube.
Good. Thank you so much, Armando. As usual, brilliant. And this is not because you're my boss. But I guess the main point that would be of interest for us to discuss, particularly when we do this counterpoint of most of the discussions that this webinar is supposed to be of interest domestically, in Brazil, and particularly, and to feed into some discussions that we're having with the new elections and things like that. So there are a number of issues that are on the table, and that the international experience would be of relevance, that could be of relevance for us to discuss. So I guess the main point, and I'm particularly looking at your remarks on the city that what would the post-pandemic look like in cities, and what is that will be there for good, that would actually change the way we do things, or what are the things that are going to go back to normal, whatever normal is. So that has, from the outset, a challenge, and that is because cities are not. Cities are always cities, but they're not exactly the same in different contexts and different cultures. Just look at, for instance, in the past, that would be a little bit more graphic, the socialist cities compared with the Western cities, for instance. They have very different structures. Some of that as a consequence of the kind of planning they did there, the kind of how planning affected land uses, and for instance, the idea of having high density, residential density in the outskirts of the cities, of the typical socialist cities. These are market differences. And there are a number of other differences that we could highlight of cities in Brazil or in underdeveloped countries, Latin America or Africa, vis-a-vis US, UK, and Europe in general. And they have to do with the relevance of the informal market and the form, not only in the labor market, that also affect dramatically the distribution of businesses and things like that, but also where people live in and under what conditions. So the thing is, when we look, okay, let's look at some of the changes that we we're observing in the US and UK and see to what extent some of them are relevant or not to understand what we could expect. For instance, you raised the issue that just to highlight some of your points. Issues of, for instance, the relevance of the property tax. We don't have the same. That is widely known. The U.S. and UK have property tax at over 3% of the GDP. In Brazil, it's not even 0.5% of the GDP, or 0.6% of GDP. Or Latin America in general is even 0.5 or whatever. So that makes a huge difference in how cities are funded. And what is the relevance of, for instance, the second one, the point that you raised, the state vis-a-vis the locals, what can be absorbed at the local level and what should remain at the higher level of governments in the U.S. and Brazil is very similar to the U.S. in the sense of the federalism that has some kind of autonomy that you don't find that much in the UK or in Colombia, that are unitary countries that have a different scheme of governance, I would say. So so when we look at our city is going to converge to a certain type of city after COVID or not, a number of factors would come to play there. So these are two of them, but and particularly I'm particularly interested in one of them that has to do with investment in infrastructure. What kind of infrastructure are we talking about? For instance, one of the main issues that whether investments, you raised some very interesting points regarding whether it's the anti-cyclical type of investment that you can rely on or not. This doesn't play the same way in underdeveloped countries or poor countries or advanced countries. And I'll just give you one very simple example for that. For instance, if you invest on the subway, for instance, the subway has the cost of a kilometer of a subway is about the same in the U.S. or in most places in Latin America. It's about $100 million for a kilometer, something like that. But in the U.S. or in the advanced countries, the fiscal effort that you need in order to fund that is much, much, much lower than in the underdeveloped countries, where the income is 5 to 10 times as higher in the U.S. So even if the participation of the government is, for instance, it's a little bit lower than what we have. In Brazil, it's about 38%. In the U.S., it's 25% or something like that. But the fiscal, simply if you compare the kind of investment you have to make, the fiscal effort, at the end of the day, it's no wonder why underdeveloped countries has such a huge deficits in these kinds of investments where the cost is so high, right? And they have to do with the public action. So there are the major issues there, and the kind of investment that we have to look at more carefully in countries like in Africa or Latin America has to do with how to bring water and sanitation to most of the places that, I mean, they're typically in Latin America, it's about 20-30% of people lacks access to good sanitation. I mean, at least that. And I would say that this is I'm being very, very conservative here. So these are very interesting points, I would say, to bring to discuss what is there a convergence of the structure of cities that we would expect after COVID, that we could say, okay, what are we learning from one context to the other? I know that in general, the land market does what it does everywhere. It concentrates, it segregates, it promotes density. These are something that would make us also think of whether what would happen with North-South comparison after the post-COVID. Is the South gonna really be further lagging comparing with, and this is, I think this is pretty much on the agenda also, that we think that these inequities at the global level is going to increase, actually, not converge, right? So there are interesting issues there as well to discuss. So my basic point is whether you could elaborate a little bit more eventually, and then probably some people may want to chip in on the specifics of this convergence, or what is the post COVID city that will emerge, and how much what are the processes that we would expect almost everywhere? What are the ones that are very country specific? And I think that there is, of course, this remote labor, but remote consumption is probably also being very, very, it's putting a major imprint in cities as well, I suspect. And that would affect dramatically for instance, the discussion of the institutionality of certain of the post office vis-a-vis in different places, or these other, just to bring one of this that is very much in the agenda nowadays in the U.S. But anyways, I don't want to overextend myself, but again, I think it's fantastic what about the topics that are on the table, and it would be nice to elaborate on how what we takeaways for lack of Africa or Asia in general from the experiences of these two major leading countries.
A quick response, all right, to Martim, and then we can open it. Thank you, Martim. And I will be very cautious about talking about convergence in terms of the city model across the world. And in particular, because I'm aware of conditions like informality, which make things very different in some countries. And I think mobility and level of urbanization and so forth are going to be important factors here. But you make me think about a certain kind of convergence that took place in the United States. There was a period of disinvestment in cities and outward movement after the Second World War, partly fueled by investment in things like highways that made it easy for people to become commuters, and also through the support of home mortgages that made it easy to acquire houses outside of cities. So this is a well-known phenomenon, but the convergence of late has been in the revival of cities, and the relative growth of central cities relative to their suburbs in many cases, including New York, perhaps best known. But I was asked a question the other day about gentrification and whether COVID will be the end of gentrification. And I understood the question to mean that cities will no longer be as desirable, and as a result, the pressure on lower income people as they are competing in the market with upper income people will be reduced. And I think that's an interesting question, and whether it's in part related to this idea of whether the post-COVID city will be more or less desirable than cities have become. Speaking again from the US-UK context. And again, speculating, but I really don't think some of the main advantages cities have will go away. I think to the extent people are nervous about the safety of cities, that's going to have an effect. But I think we've already shown certain coping mechanisms, and just thinking about the way we're organizing offices and probably having fewer people in offices, more people working remotely, I don't think that's going to end when the virus ends. I think we'll continue to have a higher share of working from home. And that suggests some different configurations of space, different land uses. It may take some of the pressure off of housing and make it possible for affordable housing to be built in cities, or even Martim and I have talked about the conversion of offices as a possibility. So some rebalancing of the composition of cities. There's no question to me that face-to-face work will continue to have a value. And yet we have learned that as we're doing now, we can be effective. We can do our work without face-to-face. So it's I don't really have a definitive view of this. I think it's hard to believe that the advantages of cities will evaporate as a result of this. And I'm told that traffic is up in a number of cities, even though there are all of these constraints and worries. So I think the death of cities has been possibly a bit exaggerated, but something different, and something more, at least in the US and the UK, I think a little more conscientious when it comes to concerns about inequality.
But what do you, sorry if I could come in again. What about the changes in consumption? Because cities are big. One of the reasons for city to exist is not only the person-to-person or the contact in offices and things like that. It's also consumption. It's market. It's finding what the diversity, and people are now, they're not going to the big stores anymore. Most of them are bankrupted. They're closing. A good number of them. So they're being substituted by remote consumption also, and at the scale that we probably didn't think it would get this far or this fast, right? So what about them? How do you see the relevance of that, for instance, to do restructuring cities also?
Right.
Because this is happening everywhere, even in, I would say that in Sao Paulo, I don't know, Tomas, you're probably shopping at the supermarket online also, right?
Yes, they increased a lot.
Yeah. So there's things like that. I mean,
the best companies in stock market are the ones that they have the huge online operation.
Yeah, so this is coming here, and probably this is going to stay, right? Because people are finding out that this is quite convenient and productive, actually, right?
Yeah. So, Martim, my view on this is that these were trends that were taking place already.
Exactly.
That the pressure on retail is not new. I think you're right. It has been accentuated by the pandemic, and people are probably getting into habits that they're not going to give up. So yeah, big department stores I think are over, but I think they already were over. I think this is simply accelerating their demise. One thing I am interested in is whether cities will continue to be as vibrant in terms of the restaurant culture, the social interaction that takes place if offices are not as vibrant. And I think, again, that competitive city, the successful city in the future, is probably going to have a good mix of residential and commercial and employment. And I can imagine it being quite successful, even if densities are slightly less than they are now and the arrangement of land uses is slightly different. But you can see the hunger people have for interaction, and it's in fact making the pandemic worse because people just can't help themselves from getting together. And then especially, I had been asked a question, by the way, about universities. And of course, many cities like Boston in the US have a very large number of students, important part of the economy. Our universities are struggling right now with the question of, can we bring everybody back to the classroom or not? Most of them are saying we can't do it the way we were doing it before. We're going to stay remote for the time being. But I think we've already had examples of kids going back to school and immediately there are outbreaks because they just can't help themselves. And I think this could be really significant in the short run, at least, and something worth paying some attention to, because it is a part of the success of many cities, having a vibrant university community. And this could change. And the other thing, which is really important, is related to your North-South question, I think, Martim, is the ability to cross international borders, the ability to freely travel. This has a huge impact on universities. You may have seen that the president considered essentially keeping out all international students who were not in the classroom. And there was a lawsuit and he lost and he backed off. But he didn't lose the lawsuit, but he backed off on the policy. But the interdependence that we have enjoyed has been disrupted. And if it's not, if we can't cure that, if we can't make it easy for people to move around, this is going to change many industries, but the university in particular, I think, is going to be very badly affected.
Good. Sir Armando, let me ask one question. You already have a couple of questions. I just would like to explore one thing that, hearing that from our reality here in Brazil, you talk a lot about inequality. And it's sounds strange for us hearing something about inequality living in Brazil, where you really have such an unbelievable inequality in our countries. And you mentioned in our previous conversations, the New Deal in England, you say the leveling up process or planning, they will try, or they will figure how to equalize different regions in UK. Could you detail a little bit more about that? What they intend to do in order to equalize? What means this equalization in terms of planning and actions in the field?
Right. So there are some fundamental reasons for the inequality, and some of them have to do with government investment policies. So if you use a principle in investing public money that says, I will put this where I get the greatest economic impact, it biases your investments to the places that have the highest productivity and further disadvantages the places, through no fault of their own, that have lower education levels or otherwise do not have the same per capita productivity as the more privileged places. So you see a tremendous investment in infrastructure, for example, around London. And, billions and billions of pounds going into things like Crossrail. And what that does is just further strengthens London to the disadvantage of the other parts of the country. So if your policy says, instead of going where the payoff is immediately the highest, you consider places that have high potential and where you will have the greatest relative effect. And this is really sort of, we got into this in an earlier conference last week, thinking about the sort of equity versus efficiency issues in infrastructure investment. And efficiency dictates that you look for the biggest bang, and by itself can work against equity, as it has in the UK. But if you think of both together, you don't have to pick the most inefficient project in order to address inequality. You can make inequality one of your key criteria when you think about investments, and then look for the most efficient, but also the most equalizing investment. This came out of a conversation with some infrastructure experts that I thought was really interesting, and I think could inform the way that the UK deals with the challenge there. So some of the specific projects that are being talked about include linking up some of the cities in the North and the Midlands and helping them to operate as more effective regions and making the connections better so that they are more competitive as London has been. So it's not an anti-London strategy, but it's really a question of balancing the way that public monies are spent. And part of the concept there is to empower the localities. And one of the innovations in governance in the UK that is a growing trend and more significant there than in the United States is the idea of metropolitan governance. So they now have in big cities like Manchester, a metropolitan mayor, a regional mayor who has a range of powers that extend beyond the city limits. And it's the kind of thing that makes sense if you're trying to manage an urban system as a system, because obviously the city boundaries are not a reflection of the true extent of the city. So there's a hypothesis that this will lead to development, and that we have seen, at least in the pre-pandemic period, substantial growth in places like Manchester and a real vibrancy. But the rest of the story is not just about physical planning. It's about people. It's about education and training. It's about all of the things that go into quality of life for people. And I think this is understood in the UK, that there is an element here that has to do with the nature of the workforce and supporting that and really starting early to build that. So I think they're potentially going to have a sophisticated strategy. It's not just about building more rail lines, but the benefits of that seem to be understood. The connectivity is important. There are agglomeration gains to be had, but I think to a large extent the understanding is that this is really about people, fundamentally, and I'm more on the physical side, so I'm not sure I can make any prescriptions there, but I know a lot is needed.
Great. So I want to make sum up some of the questions that are coming from the audience. So Alberto Maia talked about what kind of financial support is the U.S. federal government considering for those cities more dependent on sales and income tax to ease their investment budgets. I'll chain this with another question. Which is basically we mostly are talking about different cities that live in the U.S. and so people that in the U.S. So Sergio Missior is asking how those big trends that you are describing on the cities that are being accelerated by COVID, how they happen or they don't happen in the cities in the South Hemisphere with poor countries, with still a lot of social inequality, big deficits in housing and whatnot, no internet that would make telecommuting work from home more difficult. So basically, I will chain those two questions together. Is basically what is the federal government, the central government, the state government role in kind of making the equalizing the opportunities, and you can develop further on what is the New Deal being proposed by the UK, and if they could apply in those cities. So it's basically two questions in one. What is the difference between the trends in the Southern Hemisphere in poor cities, and what is the role of the central governments into easing the burden, the fiscal burden in the cities?
Right. So I have a very simple view of that sort of national government process. We have a divided government. One side says, let's spend $3 trillion and give a substantial support to the states and the cities that are suffering. The other says, let's spend $1 trillion and not do that. And the Speaker of the House says, well, you come up $1 trillion, I might come down $1 trillion, maybe we could agree on $2 trillion. And that hasn't worked so far. So I would say right now, the national government is not helping the cities and the states. And I think there are going to be consequences if that doesn't change. Because as I've mentioned, we're already seeing very substantial contractions in city budgets as a result of lost revenue. So there's a need, there's going to be suffering, there will be loss of services and loss of all sorts of public goods. So it's a serious problem. On the other hand, it's conceivably a solvable problem, and we may yet see that the federal government does come up with some support, but it's unknown right now. In terms of what government can do to deal with inequality, in the U.S. We do have inequality, and people talk about the digital divide. There are kids who are not in the classroom, but they don't have access to internet. So they're cut off completely. And so they're disadvantaged, and they're going to be more disadvantaged if we continue to have to conduct schools remotely. And obviously there are things the government can do to step in and help with that, right? Because this is not the unknown. I mean, we know what's needed, and we could be providing it. So I don't completely distinguish the U.S. from from developing countries, although I understand the challenges are much greater in developing countries. I am wondering, though, if there aren't some ways to leap over, and especially if there's a clear commitment to dealing with inequality, to finding new ways. I'm thinking of the way in which, in many countries, cell phones kind of jumped ahead or leapfrogged over the development of landlines, and also the ways in which people were very innovative in terms of how they use their cell phones to conduct all sorts of business. And I'm thinking of India in particular as a place where this goes on, but I'm sure elsewhere in the world too. So what I can imagine is some breakthroughs that provide access at lower cost in a more universal way. And I think if government accepted that as a responsibility, they could play a role in facilitating it. I wouldn't be completely disbelieving in a private sector solution to some of this as well, especially as it may be possible to monetize it. And I think we've seen that sometimes actually does provide access when folks figure out how to. Poor people spend money, right? So when folks figure out how to actually profit from that, sometimes it actually has a benefit. That might sound a little too optimistic, but
it's good to sound optimistic. Yeah, Martin, you want to compliment? Yes, you had. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think we may have at least three major points that probably is going to generate a lot of after the pandemic type of impact. One of them that you just raised, Armando, is the issue of managing or the governance of metropolitan areas. This is going to be a major. There is of course already some realization of people that the way cities have grown and they conglomerate and all that, the metropolitan areas are basically in need of some kind of authority over and above the mayors, because it's getting too far. And this is this is something that is not only happening in developed countries, but also in most underdeveloped countries as well, and where cities have expanded dramatically. And so, but in the case of Brazil, this is a major issue. The metropolitan areas Brazil is a very urbanized country, and Brazil has, I don't know how many large metropolitan areas, but cities of well over 500,000. I think is over 50 or 70. Isn't that something like that?
Something around that. Yeah,
there's a lot of metropolitan areas, but the issue there is always politics. How much of your self-determination mayors are willing to give away to a higher, and what kind of structure can you create in order to manage that? In federal countries, that's just not so easy to manage. And in unitary countries, you could always appoint someone from the national government to do that, in the UK model or whatever it is, right? But so this is clearly a huge issue, particularly if we're bound to get other pandemics in the near future, that you have to protect your borders one way. What kind of borders are we talking about? What kind of lockouts do you do in a metropolitan area, and how to have them effective? It's very hard to control the metropolitan area. You can control the whole area vis-a-vis other metropolitan areas, but not within, right? So that's so this is the first issue, whether you have any ideas of how to do that, how to overcome the political dysfunction that there is there, and how to generate some authority in between the governor and the mayor. The second one has to do with the education. I think education is going to come out of this process also with a huge new challenges, and particularly because in the U.S. has a model, and in some European countries also, of the students, they move to different cities to get higher education. This is not so much the case in Latin America, and even in Brazil. Insper will be bringing in students from other parts of Brazil, but this is not the rule. The rule is you go to a higher education in the place where you live, and you probably will be living with your parents. So there will be a major change. I don't know whether in the U.S. people that are already challenging paying tuitions for remote education when they are not using the facilities, and the universities cannot function without the high tuition they have, even with all the support they get from all kinds of grants and other research or whatever. So this may be the second one, right? And in particular, Boston is one city that would probably be with a higher concentration of higher education, is probably going to lead the way of what may happen in the future with cities like that, right? And the institute itself has done work in the past about universities as being developers, and so that may be an interesting point to bring to this discussion again. And the third I forgot now what it was. So I'll remember it and I'll come back. Okay.
You take a rain check. You got a rain check.
I could make a couple points on these two issues. So on metropolitan governance, one argument that has been successful in the past is that metropolitan governments are more efficient than smaller units, and you avoid a certain amount of duplication of expenditures on various services and so forth. So to the extent that budgets are being stressed right now, an argument could be formed that we need to cut costs and still deliver services. And one way to do that is to regionalize and serve larger areas. As I say, that has been an effective argument in some of the instances where we've seen the mergers of city and county government, and it's still not a strong movement, but it has worked. You do raise interesting issues around how one deals with contagion and whether you need larger units. So it's, I've been following cities like New York in dealing with the pandemic, and it's pretty tough, to isolate yourself when you're actually part of a, multi-state metropolitan region, and people are used to moving around through it, and they continue to do it and then spread disease. So I think it's conceivable that this is an argument for some sort of metropolitan governance. So I like that. The schooling thing, I hadn't thought about it that much, but it seems to me that the online education, the alternative university option that has already existed and is not small, is going to be tremendously strengthened by this. And I think as a result, a certain kind of university is going to go out of business. And that's probably a smaller, expensive private university that really depends on tuition and providing a certain kind of experience. And I think a number of them were already, the very small ones were already very threatened. And I don't think they're going to make it through this, because people will not pay for substitute experience. And they certainly won't pay a lot, which is what is expected in some of these, small institutions. So I think you'll see a restructuring and a lot more. I think as people now have become exposed to remote classrooms, and especially as a lot of effort is going into making that experience better than it has been in the past, I think this could have one of the most significant effects. And to the extent that universities are an important part of cities, what happens to universities will have an impact on the way cities look after this is all over. So I think this is one of just as much as the shift to shopping online, going to school online, I think is not going to go away after this, and I think it will have a restructuring effect on that whole industry.
How relevant is the stock of dormitories to be reshuffled to housing regularly, since they're not going to be used any? I don't know what is the share, for instance, in Boston, of dormitories that probably going to be empty now.
Yeah, not just dormitories, Martim. As you know, a lot of students in Boston rent apartments, and
right. That's another housing market. Yeah, I'm considering all of them. Yeah,
all over. Yeah, no, it's significant, and if there's a big change there, that will change the housing market for sure.
Yeah.
Armando, you talk about resilience and competitiveness in the cities, nah? And you wrote a book launched in 2006 in Nature and Cities, where you pointed out the ecological imperative in urban design and planning. How do you join nowadays to this resilience or to this imperative ecological thing, also the health condition of the cities, how cities should head or address this new situation in the urban planning?
Yeah, I love that question. I think this is an important moment, because people have, in many cases, rediscovered the outdoors. And I think it's partly just in contrast to all the time they're spending indoors, but it's also because there's a search for relief, and particularly in cities, I think people have revalued the open spaces that they have, the public spaces, and understand them in a new way as being much more essential than they thought they were. So I think this could be an important moment. People talk about rediscovering nature, and it is interesting. I think some of it is imagined, but just the way in which things have quieted down and slowed down to some extent in cities, so you actually can hear birds, you actually are more aware of nature in the city. I tend to believe it's real, and that this will stimulate a more serious approach, as you know, as we advocated in that book, that cities and nature aren't two dichotomous worlds, but they really are intersecting systems. And the other thing I'd like to talk about a little bit is the climate change problem. And we're concerned that people's attention is a bit off that right now. And I think it's important that we understand the ways in which cities continue to need to prepare. And, you know, we're going through an amazing heat wave right now in the US and a lot of strange weather. But I don't think people are noticing it quite as much as usual because they're distracted by the pandemic. But the climate crisis hasn't gone away. And I think there are ways in which we can think about green space in cities as being adaptive to the climate challenge, as well as providing for better health and quality of life for people who live in cities. So not to mention getting people out of automobiles is another terrific thing that could be happening. I see Martim is excited by this.
No, it's unless there is someone. Is there a question and waiting to be posed? Otherwise, I will follow up on what Armando just suggested.
Pedro has a couple of figures from the also. You can add your remarks after. Okay.
Yeah. No, it was just to keep on the sustainability issue, and because I think it's important, and it's something that we can talk about in Brazil as well. So it's not really dependent on maybe it's not as dependent on the wealth of the city. So it's basically, what do you think would be? You talked briefly about what would be the future of transportation. Like cities spend a lot of money subsidizing mass transit, public transportation in Brazil and in many cities. Like MTA in New York, there's like billions of deficit. So what happens? And right now, people, the mayors are spending more money because for sanitary reasons you have to be with. To run buses with lower capacity. So basically, how do you square the difficulty in keeping the buses and subway alive in the financial strain with the way that the people will move through the city because of health reasons?
I think it's very tough, and for sure, revenues are down and will continue to be down. Ridership will be down. The need to spread people out will create more deficits. Nobody's mentioned airplanes, by the way, but that's another tough one too. But just in terms of moving within the city, I think this will reach some kind of new normal. And it may require different practices. It may not ever come back to being the kind of capacity that we were able to use in the past. It may require more subsidy, but I think it also suggests we need more options. And if cities are going to be vibrant, I think one of the ways they can be vibrant is by being more pedestrian oriented and more bicycle oriented. And you know, the US has shown a considerable uptick in the use of bicycles during the pandemic, and cities have gone to some lengths to make it easier for people to get around on bikes. And the bike shares have actually trying to think of the generic term for these services where you share bicycles publicly. The demand is way up. So I don't have a really good answer for transit systems. I think they're going to struggle. I think it's you know, there are probably design issues that need to be addressed and the real adaptation that needs to go on there. the other thing, nobody's really raised this, but we've been just talking about this pandemic and not the next one. And I think
South Korea is already saying that there is a new one there, right?
Well, I just think that we'd be smart to be thinking about the next one and what we're learning now, and obviously on the prevention side and the treatment side and so forth. I hope we're learning how to make drugs faster that can treat these diseases and ward them off, but. It's not inconceivable that we will have a series of these. And I guess in terms of a longer term scenario planning, I would think cities should not expect to have an uninterrupted return to prior conditions, but to think about this happening now and then somewhat unpredictably. And so building in that diverse set of ways of making cities function. And I guess that's not being reliant on a single transportation system, not being reliant on, one way of working. So it's a very stimulating question, and I think it's worth actually getting some smart people to get together and consider the next pandemic and have we learned something?
Martin, go ahead.
I just want to go back to to one issue that you raised that I think it's pretty relevant, and that is the extent to which devolution and relying on the higher role for the private business or whatever to take a higher share of responsibility of how to overcome some of these difficulties and challenges. How far can we go with that? And here's the conundrum. And you made you also raised the issue of climate change. Well, climate change and pandemic has a lot in common. One of them is that they're both very susceptible to the tragedy of the commons there, right? That this means that, in other words, it's very hard to get people to collaborate at the level when they can get some very short run advantages that can actually I would say undermine their most thing they can do. So this suggests, and there has been some discussion of whether do we need a higher level of urban solidarity, of some other new institutions in order to handle that kind of situation that we would be now facing, that just leaving something like markets and things like that to dictate what each one can do may not be sufficient. And particularly when you're talking about devolution and talking about the lower level of administrations and taking a higher responsibility to that. So I wonder whether you have any thoughts about this topic, this conundrum, I would say.
I don't have a prescription, Martin, but I guess I observe that there are cultural differences that seem to either make it very difficult for people to think about the greater good, and somehow the U.S. comes to the top of the list, as far as I can see, in terms of this rugged individualism that does create a kind of...
Do not underestimate the Brazilians.
Well, I don't want to get into competition, but at any rate, I think there are cultures of greater solidarity, and I think it would be good to cultivate that, to nurture it. I don't see that we have any good options. I mean, the pandemic is proving that, to use the cliche, we're all in it together, and yet some of us are not behaving that way. And I just, I don't really have the solution, but I certainly see it as a serious problem. And the other one, which is not unrelated to the governance issues, is is the lack of government credibility. And at a time when you need people to do extraordinary things, they have to trust the government. They have to actually believe that the government knows what it's doing and is looking out for their best interests. And we seem to be at a low point in that as well. So these are difficult issues, and I don't really have, I know they need to be addressed, but I don't see any easy way to do it.
Well, first of all, let's say welcome to Camila Maurer. We invite her to join us because she's the maestro of all these webinars, and she should join us at these very end moments of our series of webinars. And then she will have a few words to talk before we finish, but we still have some time to take advantage of the opportunity of having you with us here. You talked about governance and the difference of governance in US and also in UK, and the difference of governance between cities. Particularly in the US, you have very different conditions for cities and US. But I would like to talk about governance and the point that you just mentioned. It is this idea, the solidarity, probably even here in Brazil, was the best, maybe the more surprising thing, and the best thing that society showed at this very delicate moment in our cities. It's amazing. I would say it's almost unbelievable, because here in Brazil, I think I mentioned that before. We usually see or saw this or have seen this solidarity during the Carnival and the World Soccer Cup. This is the two moments where the nation really get together, and you can feel that you belong to a nation. In the other days of our calendar, we are really a very fragmented society. And the solidarity really was an amazing thing that appears during the pandemic, and still, and probably was the solution to really provide food and all the access to these people in very precarious conditions. First thing, what do you consider, or do you think, what are your thoughts about the idea of new ways of governance and really implementing that as a solution for administrations? We are talking about a participative process of the community in a very solid and robust way, and continuous, of course. And second, do you have any example, any cities for you that could be considered a benchmark in terms of community participation, and with a strong and transformative influence in cities in US or UK?
I can probably respond more with a problem than with a great example. So among the cities that have had the most tension over the Black Lives Matter movement is Portland, Oregon. And Portland is a progressive city. It's very much a planning-oriented city. They've had great participation in planning. They're also a metropolitan government, so they've got the regional component. We've actually studied Portland quite a bit as a kind of exemplary city, and yet they had a really hard time dealing with protests and with civic unrest around racial equity issues. And I don't fully understand it, but I think it's a sign that this just isn't easy. That you can have good government, you can have well engaged and active citizenry, and that you could still be kind of thrown off by let's just say concerns that aren't being addressed and don't really know what to do. So I think you mentioned a sort of delicate moment, or a fragile moment, I think I'd say, for cities in the US. I think people are, at least the ones I know, are pretty tense. They're pretty worried, and those aren't the best conditions, I think, for democracy. I think you need a certain peace of mind, I think, to operate well as a democracy. So I see challenge. I think the good news would come as people make choices. We'll have some elections in the midst of this. We'll see how people, on the whole, react. But I suspect we might see a lot of change in the U.S. And I think we have seen some public leaders be very effective in communicating what needs to be communicated, in bringing people together to do the right thing, and in effectively dealing with the crisis. And I suppose one of the great things about the federal system, with 50 different states kind of going in their own ways, is there have been some surprisingly terrific leaders in unexpected places, really doing the right thing. And I think that will be noticed, and I would like to think it will become a trend, and that it will be reinforced. So again, as the person who is charged with being optimistic, I'd have to say that I would like to see, out of some of the sort of the bad things that we've been going through, at least an expression that we could do better, and that people will choose to do better. But it's not all bad news, and I think on a sort of individual level, as well as kind of a corporate level, people in the U.S. have been very resilient, very adaptive, and in the peaks that the worst days that I've seen were much earlier in places like New York City, where they were just overwhelmed, and I think very, very distressed, but came out of it. And I think this is a kind of event like a world war. I mean, it's just an amazing magnitude, and I think it will take us a long time to really fully understand what it's done to us. But it may make us better, and I think I tend to believe it will.
Good. Thank you so much. Martin, we have a few minutes. Do you want to summarize our how many webinars? 8? You have 2 minutes to do it.
Just summarize what Armando just said. It would be another webinar, I guess. There are so many issues that I guess the big summary that we have is that we have a lot of big important questions that are still unanswered. There are a number of major challenges because although there is something that it's a common in most of the webinars, that many of the dramatic changes that people have been highlighting, they are not exactly new. They are basically the acceleration or accentuation of something that was already happening, and this is something that almost everybody has been repeating one way or the other. It's a matter of in the issue of scale, there is a qualitative change, right? When you change the scale, at some point there are breaking points. There are discontinuities that you can generate out of that. So I think this is one of the things and there is a mathematical, there is a theory in mathematics called catastrophe theory. I don't know if any of you have heard about. This is how discontinuities can be generated through continuous processes. And there are the cusp, and there are a number of these forms that are actually, the theorem says that are about, I think, if memory serves me well, it's about 7 or 11. I don't remember anymore possible catastrophes, and that is these are things that mathematicians have developed, for instance, to understand in prisons up to when is that a disruption happens. when things have been going way to a point that something happened, that something simply out of the scale of the process itself that provokes that a breaking on the system. I mean, you may think about the racial issue now, also things like that, right? So we don't know exactly when it will happen and how to anticipate and how dramatic is the fall or the break is. But we know that this is something that we have to deal with now. And I guess going back to the original point of Armando, of scenario planning may be the right tool to deal with that and to simply anticipate possible catastrophes, the different types of catastrophes, and how to, if they happen and then take a certain shape, what should be your best strategy to deal with that today to handle that if it happens tomorrow. So I think we're more or less in this kind of world. We don't know exactly what's going to happen with internal mobility in cities, whether cities are going to become more polycentric or not. That's just something that there's a number of things that may come in, and we would hope that the post-pandemic world would generate an environment that would make it easier to police nuclear cities, and this is something that's very desirable, I guess, for most planners nowadays, to reduce a number of 15 minutes and things like that people have been talking, right? So I guess what we have learned over these last 8, and there are very difficult issues still to be reckoned. We know a number of things that are happening. We don't know how intense they are and how they're going to play together, and when this continuity is going to happen, right? I guess this is my understanding of the synthesis of what we've been exposed to with these very, very interesting presentations that we were lucky to have the chance of hearing.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think we still with a lot of questions. Of course, it's too early to have definitive answers for that, but certainly we have some enlightenment in order to some possibilities, some ideas, and some ways to conduct that. It's really a new situation. Probably is going to be repeated, and of course it's a warning signal for urban plannings, for citizens, for societies, and for countries as well. I think it was an amazing experience, such an opportunity to share and to listen to all those experts in urban planning. I'm really, I have to say again to Armando Carbonell, thank you so much. We are so grateful for you, for your time, for your insights, and also for sharing your time with us. It's really, and to the Lincoln Institute as a whole. I asked Camila to join us because she was the manager, the maestro, the chairman, the CEO of all of that. She worked quite hard with Bia Vanzolini. Bia is not with us, but Camila deserves all thanks and everything, because she really promoted such an amazing series of urban planning. I would say all thanks to the Department of Communication Journalism, Pedro Burgos and João Gabriel. João is not with us today, but it was also amazing sharing the mediation of the debates. And to Martin, it was such a good experience sharing these panels and hearing you as well, your thoughts and also your insights about cities. I say I'm so grateful for all of you guys and for the institutions, and for us at the Arq.Futuro City Lab at Insper is one of our first initiatives at Insper, and I think we really reached the things that we consider the most important things: an open debate, different backgrounds sharing and proposing and promoting discussions about cities. You really need to address the complexity of cities in a new way, and I'm sure that we have the opportunity and this diversity of knowledge, backgrounds, and ideas in the very propitious moment here with us. I also have to. Go ahead.
The final line in the Casablanca. Louis, I think this is the beginning of a long friendship.
That's perfect. This is very illustrative of our start of our relationship. But I also have to say thank you for all the team at Insper, Diego and his team, and also Mayara, Luciana, Bruno. Of course, we know we have such a strong back people here supporting us and all technological and marketing things. Well, guys, thank you so much. What's really a great pleasure. I am looking forward to meet you again soon in other discussions. And I have just a few words about our new series that starts on social urbanism. It's a partnership with the people of Recife and also of people EAFIT in Medellin, and we will start from Wednesday on a new series on social urbanism and the ideas of investments in the precarious and more vulnerable areas in the cities in Brazil and Colombia. Thank you, guys. Looking forward to see you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Camila, thank you so much.
Armando. This was great.
Thanks, Martim.
Tomas, and hope to keep in touch. Camila, nice job.
Take care. Thank you all.
E obrigado à audiência aí que nos acompanhou essa jornada toda.
Valeu, gente.
Tchau.